One factor within family-friendly filmmaking that may seem quite minor to some, but I think is quite important to talk about, is how emotions, and more specifically for this video, grief, is portrayed within films. By this, I'm not talking about how the audience feels when they're watching a particular film, although that is an important consideration when you're going to be making a film, but what I'm talking about instead are the actual emotions that the characters themselves feel within the film. But before I get into the main part of this video, I just want to preface it by saying that I know different people handle grief differently. There are some people that just don't cry at all, there are some people that will cry endlessly for days, and there will be other people that just, in a sense, delay the response. I do understand all of this, but I still believe that grieving should always be very clearly shown, especially in family-friendly films, because I believe that when you're dealing with topics like this, you need to show the reaction, because otherwise kids may get the wrong idea of how they themselves should handle the grieving process. So even though if the characters were real, they may not have their reaction during the film's runtime, I do feel like it is an important thing to show during the film, and we should just assume during the film that all of the characters will show their emotions straight away, and I'll be going more into this within the video itself. I am also not a medical professional. I haven't studied medicine or, mental health issues or anything like that. So I am just saying what I've learned from reading many things, from looking at many articles, and most importantly, I think from talking to and also listening to the experiences of people who have been through grief and anxiety and all of those sorts of things. As always, the links that I have used are linked in the description. If you do notice anything that's wrong though, do please let me know in the comment section and I'll pin your comment, or I'll just make my own pinned comment or something like that. Because I do want this to be as accurate as possible. I did try and spend time to make it as accurate as possible. Thankfully, I am starting this video on a positive note. When thinking of animated films, many of them actually handle grief really well. For example, Simba in The Lion King was clearly shown to be suffering throughout the film following his dad's death, and Littlefoot in The Land Before Time, in which this topic of grief was actually directly talked about, also was shown to have been very much affected by his mother's death.
It's not fair. She should have known better. That was a sharp tooth. It's all her fault.
And then of course there's the one that always comes to my mind, which is Hiro's grieving process in Big Hero 6, following Tadashi's death. I'm happy to say that this will be less of a video covering what films could do to improve in this aspect, even though there are some minor examples that I will be mentioning, but it will be more of a video that's raising awareness of the importance of this representation. And if any of you are wanting to make your own films, this will hopefully make you take this into account if you are showing a movie death. As for the majority of films, they do understand the grieving process quite well actually, and they manage to show it in a way that still makes the film enjoyable, but also makes it realistic, and I think beneficial to the viewers, especially if they're kids who may not have had the topic brought up to them in the past. But just so you know what you're looking for when you look at a film and see whether it handles grieving well or not, I'm going to be going over the stages of grief. So if you already know what the stages are, you can skip to the time code that's going to be over here somewhere, and you can skip past this bit. And also bear in mind, even though I'm saying these stages, not everyone's going to experience all of the stages, and some people may experience them in different orders to other people. Although this is generally how people experience grief. There are 5 stages when it comes to grief that most people go through, and the first one is usually denial. This is where they isolate themselves from anything to do with the person and generally try not to talk about it. And as a coping mechanism, they just try to pretend that everything is fine and they pretend that nothing happened. Next after that usually comes anger. So this usually comes after the denial phase has kind of worn off. And in this phase, all of the built up emotions within the person usually are expressed as anger, with this anger possibly being directed at family members, but sometimes even strangers, the person that has died, or any object that's around the room. Next after that comes bargaining. This is where we try to think of the scenarios that we could have done to change the outcome of what happened to the person. Or we think of ways that we could have helped the person to stay alive in some way. This is usually in the form of the if only statements. For example, if only I would have not given them so much sugary food. Or if only I would have cared for them more. That kind of thing. Next is depression, which is a deep sadness over a long period of time. In this case, it's not only caused by the death, but it's also caused by the costs that are related to the funeral and everything else to do with the death, and also for general worries and other things like that. And finally, some people are lucky enough to get to the acceptance stage, which isn't a sign of strength or weakness either way, but is a stage where people get through the pain that was brought along by the grief and become a lot happier in themselves. Grief is complex and is unique in every person, but for some people, they are able to become at peace with the death of a person and start to accept the new state of their lives without that other person. Also, the way that the person reacts and how easily they can get over the death does depend on how the death happened. For example, the grieving process for somebody who lost their lives naturally would be easier for the family over a family that has to deal with the loss of somebody who, for example, was murdered or lost their lives prematurely in another way. Not trying to downplay any forms of grieving, grieving is a very hard process for everyone, but the way a person dies does make a difference to the friends and family. And when character grief is done well in films, these traits do start to emerge within the runtime. In Big Hero 6, for example, there is clear anger caused by death, which is then amplified when Hiro knows that somebody is to blame for it. And in The Lion King, there is clear denial in Simba, where he doesn't want to return to Pride Rock and face what has happened and what his new life will be following it. Within many of these films too, there's also the underlying depression which keeps pulling characters down throughout the film at various points. Although, since they are usually occupied with other things within the film, it's not going to be as consistent as perhaps it would be for a grieving person in real life when they don't have all those things to deal with. Even so though, you can still generally feel that weight of death pulling down on the characters within these films, and as the audience, we do still feel that this is an issue that is, more times than not, in the character's mind. As I said though, there are still some films that do have some issues in this department. Two examples would be Legend of the Guardians and Brother Bear. In fact, the emotions at the end of Brother Bear are one of the biggest issues that I have with this film as a whole. And it doesn't get much better in the sequel for that matter either. In Brother Bear, what basically happened here is that I don't think Coda's reaction to learning about his mum's passing was handled in the best way. Although I do have to say earlier on in the story, Denahi's grief was handled quite well, at least until the end of the story. But anyway, focusing on Coda, you have to remember that Coda's a cub, basically a young child, who is having to deal with this grief. His mum's death was a murder done by the guy that he ends up basically taking on as a surrogate brother by the end. Again, that's literally his mother, and he did seem to be quite close to her. Yes, Coda was upset for like a minute, but there is no way on earth that a kid would literally not only forgive the guy who unnecessarily murdered his mother, but also love him in the way that he does, basically as a brother, in just the span of time, literally minutes after him knowing about the news. Like, seriously, I love the film, but the ending makes no sense for so many reasons. And my issue with Legend of the Guardians was similar. Soren's brother died, but literally nobody mentioned him at the end of the film. Nobody even seemed bothered. His parents literally seemed to be over the moon when Soren got back, and didn't even question what happened to Clud. And this is even though it was evident from earlier on in the film that they cared about him and were hopeful for his future. Why is this an issue though? Surely films where characters are all dancing around happy, Shrek style, should be what filmmakers are going for, right? Well, the issue, I think, is that it may give kids the wrong impression of how fast they should get over death and how they should handle it all. They might think that they may need to get over a death, like, within a day, like some of the characters do in films, or that they shouldn't feel certain emotions that they will inevitably feel. I mean, don't get me wrong, forgiveness especially is a good thing to be able to do, and it is of course a positive thing in most cases, but I feel like these films could give kids the wrong impression that they should be able to do what the characters do as fast as they do it, if they are put in similar situations. I just think that it is a very bad mentality to build up as a child, especially since it could creep into adulthood if nobody talks to the individual about it. In the real world, if you are close to somebody, you are biologically wired to get upset if they do pass away, no matter whether they were a murderer or a bad person or a good person. If that person was a murderer or was a very bad person, you may be able to think good riddance, but the fact is that the memories that you had together and all of the good times that you had together will still be there in your brain, and it will still be a painful death for you. Believe it or not though, many people struggle to even get to that good riddance stage. For example, parents might have a hard time thinking that their child even did anything wrong, even when they're faced with overwhelming evidence, and even if they're directly threatened by their child. In an article on Psychology Today that discussed how mothers view their children after they had committed murders, many of them turned to denial. They made excuses for them, and one of them even said, "You'll always be my precious little son." She literally said this to her serial killer son before his execution. And yes, this will differ from person to person, obviously, but if I relate this back to Legend of the Guardians, it was clear that Clud's parents did care for him and were eager to give him a good future, even though he was a royal pain most of the time. And the thing is too, is that they didn't even know the damage that he'd done. They weren't there for pretty much the entire film, so how could they know what his son did unless Soren literally told them? I just find it so hard to believe that this scene would have happened in this way, and that's not even taking into account the pain that Soren himself would have been under after literally seeing Clud falling into the flames. I mean, that's some traumatic stuff right there. Yes, he shows a bit of pain, but one flight home and it's as if nothing happened. I think a bittersweet ending would have been better for this film. Yes, celebrate, but also show acknowledgement for Clud's family that this is hard for them, and give that message that even though he was bad, his family will still struggle after the death. I think some sort of exchange saying that they'll miss him or something similar to that would have been good. Basically, do what the Prince of Egypt did. They handled it in a brilliant way on that film.
Brother.
It was literally just a single sentence of dialogue, but it made it feel that much more real, and like Moses was struggling that much more about what his brother did. Instead, in Legend of the Guardians, even Eglantine, whose name I'm sure I just butchered right there, the younger sibling basically, was totally fine with all of this. The thing is, Egleen wouldn't have understood the full extent of what was happening, and wouldn't have been as unaffected as he was shown to be at the end of the film. And actually, another thing is, it's not even as if Clud was actually a bad owl. He was literally brainwashed. His death was an actual tragedy, yet they just forget about it at the end of the film. And obviously, this lack of emotional expression won't have a big effect on somebody if they're just going to watch this film once and then go and watch a whole load of other films afterwards, where grief is portrayed in a better way. But if this is a kid's favourite film, for example, and it's a film that they want to watch over and over again, especially at that age when they're taking in as much information as they can about the world around them, I could see this becoming an issue. And they did kind of try and attempt to bring this in a bit with the ending of Brother Bear, where they brought down Sitka and Coda's mum in the form of spirits. But I still don't think that was enough. The thing is, this was a shock death, because if you think about it, Coda didn't actually get to say goodbye to his mum, and the ending doesn't really count because his mum couldn't talk to Coda. It wasn't a proper interaction, I don't feel. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, Coda literally seemed more upset in the sequel when Nita left. And that's not even taking into account the literal shock that Coda would have gotten after his new brother literally said that he murdered his mum. Like, it's a big thing. And all of this is on the back of a little cub who, at that age, would have been very dependent on his mother. But there is the cute play fighting at the end of this film, and I just cannot stay mad at it for long. I do think, though, that if films don't handle grief properly, we could get situations where a child is faced with hardship and generally don't know what to do with their emotions. They may think that they're not supposed to cry or they're not supposed to be shocked, they're just supposed to kind of get over it and, be fine like an hour later, which is what some of the characters in the films that I mentioned before do. I think even worse though, and this is mainly the case with live action films and superhero films, are the ones that show men just being fine and allow women to cry while they don't allow the men to cry. Yes, as I said, each person does handle grief uniquely, and some people naturally don't have the urge to cry. They express their emotions in other ways. But I feel like it's unhealthy for any age group to just see men hide their emotions while only women are allowed to cry. The male brain isn't different in how it handles grief to the female one. They need to release that buildup of emotions. But the difference is that some of them just hold it in, which isn't healthy at all. Oh, and by the way, even though I'm showing The Hobbit for this, I do have to give props to Lord of the Rings for acknowledging the fact that people don't just get over losing somebody important to them, and they had this whole scene that was just people breaking down after something happened to a particular person. Just stop making people think that crying is just for the weak or for the soft or just for girls. Sadness and expressing sadness is literally a human emotion. Hollywood really need to stop making it seem like it's not a male thing or it's just a weak thing. It's literally a human emotion like any other emotion. They really need to stop depriving people of that. Films can have a huge impact on kids. As they grow up, they take in as much information as they can, and you have to remember that their brains are very malleable, so any information that they can get, they'll put into their brains, whether that's from films or from whatever. And this is how they pick up languages and everything else that they need to learn in early life that they'll then use for the rest of their lives. And fun fact about this actually, children's brains are so malleable that at a very early age, their genes, and I literally mean their genes, can be, to simplify it, switched off or switched on based on their environment and how their parents treat them and all those sorts of things. Yes, their genes can literally change. This can change what diseases they get later on in life and many other aspects of their personality, as well as what they'll have to face in the future. This is how identical twins can end up being so different from one another, even though they are genetically identical to each other. And this malleability, combined with the child having a harder time telling what is real versus what is not real, can mean that the messages and mannerisms are taken in without much thought from the child's part. And if society doesn't do anything to push them away from those particular thoughts, which can be a good or a bad thing depending on what the thoughts are, these thoughts can be internalized by the child. By this, I'm not saying that adults are totally immune either. Yes, their brains are less malleable, but propaganda is still a thing. But that's a discussion that would take a whole video in of itself. So I'm not going to be talking about that here. This video is already long enough as it is. What I am saying though is while this can happen in adults and is still dangerous to them, children's brains are literally designed to pull in information from everywhere, so they are even easier to be manipulated because chances are this stuff is all new to them and they haven't had those previous years of experience to then come up to conclusions on particular things. So what is extremely important is that parents tell children that it is fine to express their emotions and that they show children the effects of grief and they let them generally explore their emotions and explore the world around them. Although obviously they do have to go over what is right and wrong. You know, you don't want your kids joining the KKK without you realizing or anything like that. But the thing is, parents or the kids' primary caregivers are the individuals that kids rely on the most when they're growing up, even if there are other nurturing adults that they do have a relationship with. And from the other side, parents are wired to care about their kids a lot too, especially with the primary caregiver. As a quick aside, and sorry that I keep doing this, I do love these random psychology facts though. Why I'm saying primary caregiver in what is usually the place of what is called a mother's love is that it isn't actually always a mother that shows this love. Recent evidence suggests that a mother's love is actually just basically shown in the primary caregiver, whether that person is male or female or anywhere in between. Whoever is the person in charge of looking after the kid, no matter their sex, will actually be the one that has the release of oxytocin, which then activates the amygdala. With the amygdala being the part of the brain that causes the primary caregiver to become deeply alert about the kid and worry about them forever. And yes, I literally mean forever. This part of the brain actually doesn't get switched off for the rest of the parent's life. The amygdala of the partner does change in size too though, with it becoming around a quarter of the size of what the primary caregiver's amygdala is. Because of this deep psychological relationship between the child and the parents, what the parent says can really make or break the child and can literally change physical aspects of the brain. This was actually seen in research that showed that a child whose parents are slower to deal with the child's stress actually have a bigger hippocampus, and the opposite was also found to be true too. Scientists think that this is because the kids have to deal with their own stress, but no matter what the reason is, it shows that a parent's parenting style can actually physically change the brains of their child. They really should use this power to teach kids the skills that they need to teach, and they shouldn't push back on things that they think the kids shouldn't know about or won't be important in their lives. Kids should be able to effectively express emotions, and they need to be taught how to do this by their parents. I also think that death shouldn't be sugarcoated too, for example, just by saying that the person's gone on holiday or something like that. Because the thing is, the kid is going to be faced with that at some point in the future anyway, and when you do tell them, they'll have the shock of, oh, this person is dead, and will also have the anger of the fact that you basically lied to them saying that they were just on holiday. But unfortunately, not all kids have that parental support, whether or not that is the fault of the parents. There could be a variety of reasons why they can't give kids that support. And I know I personally wouldn't rely on the education system to teach any of that. You don't want to get me started on how bad I think the education system is. So you probably know that I'm getting a grief representation in films being a last resort for kids, but in a sense, it is a last resort for kids. But what about for those kids that don't have access to films or any of that? Well, this is where it kind of gets a bit sad. Research has shown that if a child is dealing with high levels of fears, anxiety, or other stresses at a young age, they will have a harder time learning in the future, no matter how much potential they had. This is because kids who have had a lot of toxic stress in their lives, which is defined by IGI Global as a high level of stress created when one faces extreme stress for prolonged periods of time, will end up having a noticeably different brain to a kid that hasn't experienced much stress or any toxic stress. This also wouldn't have been helped by the kids missing out on some of the necessary early learning that they would have had earlier in life. Instead of kids doing this, they would have been more worried about their environment and how unsafe it is and things like that. Because yes, this huge quantity of learning just isn't really something you can do that easily later on in life, because your brain just doesn't take in as much information as you do when you're a little child. Because when you're in your first few years of life, 1 million neural connections are actually made per second. Yes, that is literally per second. You are making 1 million neural connections. They are reduced later on in life through a process called pruning, but this just goes to show just how much a kid is learning at an early age. This is why, if you've got something age appropriate to teach the child, teaching it to them as soon as they'd be able to understand it is a really good idea. This may be outside of the parent's control though in certain situations. If one or more of the parents die, for example, or another loved one dies, a child will still go through similar toxic stress at no fault of their parents. But this is where good representation comes in, I believe, for those kids who are lucky enough to have access to films. By accurately showing kids what grief is from an early age, chances are if they are faced with a situation where somebody dies and they are grieving about it, they will be able to know better how to face it for themselves, and might also actually be able to help other people too who may be struggling from grief. That is, of course, if they're not taught bad ideologies that tell people to repress their emotions. This isn't a temporary struggle, but a lifelong one. And as I said before, such stress can cause developmental delays, and is especially damaging to children. And in that sense, media also plays another role in the form of escapism. Films and TV shows are what people will turn to when they're grieving as a way to escape their own world and live through somebody else's world for at least an hour and a half. And believe it or not, films that are sad can actually be the ones that are therapeutic to people who are going through the grieving process. According to research done at Oxford University, watching traumatic films can actually increase a person's pain tolerance and can also make us feel good due to endorphins that are released into the body. We literally get happy seeing other people in pain. Our minds are really weird. There are reasons for this though, with the main ones being that it acts as a release for our emotions, it can make us feel better about our own lives, and it reminds us that others find grieving hard to cope with too. This, again, is another reason why it's important for grief in films to play out just as it would do in real life. Kids or adults who are going through the grieving process will likely be able to relate to these characters, and will take comfort in seeing their own struggles portrayed through another person. These characters can also become role models for these kids, so that they can see some of the things that they should do if they're at their low point. And they will have someone to, in a sense, go to if they need to see somebody that they can relate to for an hour or so. Although, just thinking about it now, let's just hope that they watch Big Hero 6 all the way to the end.
Baymax, destroy.
For real though, when researching this video, something that did cross my mind is what about violence? You know, if I'm saying that grief is a good thing to have in films because children will then pick that up and will use it within their own lives, where does that leave violence? Are kids going to see violence and then want to use that in their own lives too? And how is there that kind of disparity between the two? Why doesn't one work and the other one does work? And heck, while we're talking about media, let's bring in video games too, because people like to point at video games as a reason for violence. I've always thought that the video games cause violence debate was nonsense, but thing is though, and stick with me on this, I promise I'll get to the other side in a bit, violence in media has actually been shown to cause kids to act in a more violent way. Studies have shown that preschoolers who watch violent cartoons and other violence shows are more likely to be more aggressive in the playground and are more likely to be more aggressive to carers and teachers and people like that, as compared to people who don't watch those violent shows. There's also the fact that watching a lot of violence can make you more desensitized to that violence. Just kind of like if you're wanting to cut up chicken, the first time cutting up chicken will be really hard to do. It will be all gooey and pink and gross and, you know, not orange like it should be. But after doing it a few times, you kind of get used to it and you're desensitized to it. To further back up this side, before I talk about the other side, in a study of 8 to 12-year-olds, they were made to watch either Rocketeer or National Treasure, with one version of the films having guns in them and another version not having the guns in them. After the kids viewed these films, they were presented with a room full of toys and they were set free to play, probably much to the happiness of the parents. They didn't do this to please the parents though. In that room they hid a real gun as they wanted to see what would happen if kids did find that real gun. Well, unfortunately, the kids ended their short lives on the gun wasn't loaded. But yeah, if it were loaded, that could have easily happened, as well as a few people on the street also getting a bullet in their head too. From the kids that found the gun, which was around 83%, 27% of them did the right thing and they gave it back to the experimenters. But of the other people that found the gun, of the people that watched the films with guns in them, they held it on average for around 53.1 seconds, while the people that didn't watch the film with guns in it held it for an average of 11.1 seconds. And then, as for the kids who watched the films without any guns in them, they didn't pull the trigger once. But as for the kids who did watch the films with guns in them, they on average pulled the trigger twice each. with one kid pointing the gun out of the window at passers-by below, and another kid putting the gun up to another kid's temple and then pulling the trigger. This sounds terrible, especially when you consider the fact that the people doing the violence look so darn attractive. A large majority of them show no remorse, and many show the victims not experiencing any pain. And much of this violence is also done for humorous reasons too. But, and I'm so sorry for taking so long to get to this part, statistically, this all doesn't add up when you consider the video game numbers compared to the violence numbers in society. As of May 6, 2020, Fortnite, you know, the game with dances that make me feel like smashing my head against the wall, announced that it had 350 million registered players, who have collectively put in 3.2 billion hours into the game. And also bear in mind that these stats are just for one of the violent games out there. There's many more, obviously. And when you look at Statista, as of 2018, 66% of the US population play video games, with a 2019 Newso study of active gamers aged 10 to 40, finding that 41% of those gamers actively play Battle Royale games. And when you put this to the population size of the US, which was 331 million as of 2020, and yes, I know these are all statistics from different years, although they wouldn't have changed that much within that span, that means that around 90 million people actively play Battle Royale games. Now, when you put this to the statistics of the firearm death rates by Statista from the 70s to 2017, the death rate by firearms was actually at its highest point in the pre-2000s, with it going down sharply after the 2000s. It is slowly continuing to rise, but it is not at a rate anywhere close to what would be caused by Battle Royale games and their rapid growth. This is also further evidenced by how these deaths were caused. In 2018, according to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC for short, tragically, 61.5% of firearm deaths in the US were suicides, and this number continues to rise. This means that more time than not, video games where your objective is usually to shoot other things and to avoid getting killed yourself is not going to be to blame. Instead of blaming video games, people should be looking into the more pressing issues around mental health care and other stresses that are likely to be the causes. But I don't want to get too deep into that. Oh, and by the way, just before I go on from this bit, if you want to hear more about the effect of violence in video games, in the description there's a video about the topic by the late John Bain, or Total Biscuit. He also helps to back up some of my claims that video games do not cause an increase in gun violence, and goes way more in depth into it. Man, I miss that guy's videos, he was really good. But why is there a disparity there though? Why will effective grieving in films be a positive effect on people, but then violence in media doesn't affect the people? Well, there is a reason for that, and that is down to one thing that I did mention before, which is environment. If you remember earlier, I did mention that parents are the most influential people in a child's life, and the environment as a whole can have a big impact on a child's view of what is seen as right or wrong. Since we as a society condone violence, and it is, for good reason, seen as a very awful thing to do, the message of violence being glamorous or a way to deal with your problems on a day-to-day basis is in a sense overridden. Although we should be careful that even though we do this with violence, we shouldn't do this with other emotions and shouldn't override what the films tell people about that too. To allow for the person to express their emotions well and to grieve effectively, we need to show them that it's okay to do that and help them along the way too. If they aren't acting in the way that they would usually be acting, or are acting in a more negative way, we need to not get annoyed at them, but we need to give them the space to express those emotions and to express their grief and just be there for them instead of trying to push them away. What can be hard for adults though is the process of unlearning some of the damaging traditions and thought processes that have been around in society. For a long time, showing emotions and effectively grieving have been seen as weak or a taboo thing to do, especially for men. These honestly really stupid and harmful traditions are just gonna lead to a society that's just not as good as it could otherwise be, and is more damaged than it would have otherwise be. This lack of communication and horrible societal norms for some cultures is why when this sort of thing isn't talked about in society and kids aren't taught what grief is or how to deal with it, I do feel like falling back on films is what they're going to have to do to learn about grief. Because even if grief isn't taught in society, at least they'll be able to learn it through those films. And if the films do it well, then they'll learn how to effectively do it. And as I said, this is why I don't think violence is an issue, because, as I said, violence is pretty much condoned in every society, so we don't really have to worry about that. So that's why I think Big Hero 6 showing grief so effectively is really important, and why I'm so happy that a film is out there that shows it off so well and does such a good job of portraying it. Even though Big Hero 6 is violent, it effectively shows what it is like to grieve and the real damage that violence can cause to the people themselves, as well as the people around them. Its portrayal of grief is brilliant in so many ways, and I believe that as a parent, if you were teaching children the basic values of being kind to one another and also link this grieving to the effects of violence, your kids will be totally fine no matter how many virtual flosses they kill or how many superhero films they enjoy. Thank you all for watching this video. I hope you liked it. This was a very hard one to do. Getting all of the facts correct and linking everything together was very hard. If you appreciate that, please consider supporting me on Patreon. The link for that is down in the description down below. If you support me on here, it will help contribute towards the content that I'm going to keep putting out on this channel. And we'll also get you great rewards in return too, such as being able to see videos early, being able to see my scripts, and other perks too. So anyway, for now, I hope you all stay safe, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you all in the next video, which may or may not be me gushing over a DreamWorks film that I absolutely love. So yeah, I'll see you on the next video, bye.